By now, you're probably aware that Europe is in an energy crisis. However, most people have no idea just how serious this crisis is, especially not Europe's leadership. The policy ideas being proposed by Europe's leadership are all going to make things much, much worse. And there are three policies in particular that have been put forward by Europe's leadership that combined will form Europe's economic death triangle. Now, to understand the three facets of Europe's economic death triangle, you have to first understand the basics of supply and demand. If it's your goal to affect the price of any good or service, be it natural gas or widgets or cars or houses, you need to address either supply or demand. Price does not move without one of those two things budging. Which brings me to my first facet of Europe's death triangle, and that is price caps. Now, this may be a short-term, politically expedient solution being proposed by politicians, but it does nothing to address either supply or demand. In short, price caps, otherwise known as price controls, do not work. Any time throughout history that any manner of price controls has been attempted, they have failed. They have created shortages. It's commonly said that the solution to shortages is higher prices. And right now, Europe has a shortage of energy being caused by the geopolitical situation in Europe and decades of neglecting energy policy by Europe's leaders. And so when there is a shortage, the only way for that shortage to be resolved is for prices to rise until demand gets destroyed. Now, I realize when I say demand destroyed or demand destruction, what we're talking about is people's lives getting more difficult because demand gets destroyed when people can no longer afford to pay for those higher energy prices. It stinks, but this is the reality of the situation in Europe. However, with European leaders proposing price caps, there will be no demand destruction. Europeans will not be incentivized to use any less power because the price is not rising. And here we go, dated September 1st in the Wall Street Journal. Europe weighs price cap to bring down electricity prices. The European Commission is preparing a proposal to deal with skyrocketing electricity prices by curbing consumer demand and capping power prices paid for non-gas sources of power generation. The Commission wants other forms of generation that have lower fuel costs, from wind and solar power to the region's nuclear plants, to be paid lower prices. Consumers would then pay a price that reflects the blended cost of Europe's electricity generation. So what the European Commission is proposing here is that the nuclear plants, the windmills, the solar panels, the coal plants, they don't get to raise their power prices just because the natural gas plants are getting more money. Well, what they're doing is they are disincentivizing competition for natural gas. If you don't let the other market participants benefit from the higher prices, then where is the incentive for those participants to produce more energy so you'll be less reliant on natural gas? What the European Commission is doing here is they are limiting the amount of money power generators can make at a time when they need those generators to make investments in more power. And further, what the European Commission is doing is they're proposing to put caps on retail electricity prices, i.e. the price you pay on your electric bill. Well, if retail electricity prices are not allowed to rise, but the cost to generate that electricity continues to rise as fuel costs go up, well, now you're placing your generators at an economic disadvantage. And again, you need them to invest in more generation. How are you going to get them to make that investment if you're putting them out of business? Now, that's why I say on this channel all the time that, simply put, price controls do not work. If the solution to shortages is higher prices, then when you put a ban on higher prices, what you're creating is government-mandated shortages. And that's why this is the first facet of Europe's economic death triangle, price caps. Now, again, one of the worst things about these price caps is that they're eliminating any incentive for other generators that are competing with natural gas to create any new energy supply, which leads me to the second side of Europe's economic death triangle, inaction on supply. Simply put, Europe's leadership is doing absolutely nothing to get any new energy supply into market. They're just repeating the same boring, tired talking points of the last 20 years about transition to renewables and clean energy and green energy and this and that, unicorns and rainbows and powering a society with good intentions. It doesn't work. It hasn't worked for the last 20 years and is not going to work next year. And since they have price caps preventing any higher prices from creating demand destruction, then the only possible solution to that shortage is going to be new supply coming online. But if you take the words of Europe's leaders, there is no supply coming online anytime soon. But you don't have to take my word for it. Take it straight from the source. This is from the head of the International Energy Agency. His name is Faith Birrell, And this was in Fortune magazine, just dated yesterday. Moscow is winning the energy battle, and 2 other myths about the global energy crisis, according to the top energy chief. Now, this is not some nameless schmuck. This is the head of the International Energy Agency. This is an intergovernmental organization for the sole purpose of providing energy security. And listen to what he has to say. We're going to overlook his first myth about the propaganda war between Russia and Europe, but take a look at myths number 2 and number 3. His myth number 2 says today's global energy crisis is a clean energy crisis. This is an absurd claim, says Birol, who explains that he constantly meets with policymakers and none complain of relying too much on clean energy. In fact, they rather wish they had more. I'm not surprised this was their stupid idea to begin with. They're not going to admit to that now. He notes that policymakers regret not moving faster to build solar and wind energy plants and improving the energy efficiency of buildings and vehicles and extending the lifetime of nuclear plants. More low-carbon energy would have helped ease the crisis, and a faster transition from fossil fuels toward clean energy represents the best way out of it. Now, I have done a number of videos about how this clean transition is a myth. It just does not exist. Folks, we are now more hopelessly addicted to fossil fuels than at any point throughout human history. After decades of the lies and propaganda about how wind and solar and clean energy will come to the rescue and save us from climate doom and make us all wealthy and rich, it was all BS, folks. Clean energy, wind and solar, cannot power our society. In fact, the very reason Europe is so hopelessly addicted to Russian natural gas right now is because for 20 years, they've let their nuclear and coal infrastructure rot on the ground while doing nothing but building wind and solar, and every installed megawatt of wind or solar power is actually about 3/4 of a megawatt of natural gas, because most of the time the wind isn't blowing and half the time the sun isn't shining, and that means you need natural gas as a backup 3/4 of the time. By the way, if you're using natural gas 3/4 of the time, then it's not really a backup, is it? Now, Birol says myth number 3 is that the energy crisis is a huge setback that will hinder us from tackling climate change. The unfolding crisis is a stark reminder of the unsustainability of the current energy system, which has been dominated by fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution. This is an opportunity to make this a historic turning point towards a cleaner, more affordable, and more secure energy system, Birol says. And there you have it, folks. The people in Europe that set energy policy have not learned their lesson. They haven't looked at the last 20 years and said, we have pumped trillions of dollars into windmills and solar panels that don't work, and that we're now more hopelessly addicted to foreign fossil fuels than ever before. No, they're doubling down on that stupid idea that wind and solar will save us if we just put another billion or another 2 billion into the problem. So by repeating these tired, incorrect, scientifically and mathematically illiterate talking points about green energy saving us from this gas crisis, Europe's leaders are by default taking no action to ensure any new energy supply comes to market. And that makes the second facet of Europe's economic death triangle. There is inaction on new supply. Remember, if you don't address either demand or supply, you can't expect to have any impact on price. They've capped prices, so there will be no demand destruction, and they're doing nothing to create any new supply. Well, those are the only 2 ways you can get prices to come down, is by either reducing demand or increasing supply. But just those 2 alone, that's only a recipe for higher energy prices. This isn't quite a death sentence yet until you factor in the third facet of Europe's economic death triangle, and that is bailouts. Now, we're all familiar with the expression that to a hammer, everything looks like nails. Well, to Keynesian economists, any problem looks like a problem that can be solved with more money printing. Never mind the fact that that's what got us into this inflationary mess that we're all suffering from right now. Clearly, the only reasonable solution is more money printing, right? Well, take a look at this one in Bloomberg, dated today. Energy trading stressed by margin calls of $1.5 trillion. Exchange requirements to secure trades is sucking up capital, and governments are under pressure to provide the market with liquidity. Now, when you hear provide market with liquidity, I want you to think bailout, because that's what that is. That is the central banks printing money, the government borrows it, and then the government gives it to the utilities in order to bail them out. European energy trading is being strained by margin calls of at least $1.5 trillion, putting pressure on governments to provide more liquidity buffers, i.e. bailouts, according to Norway's Equinor. Aside from fanning inflation, the biggest energy crisis in decades is sucking up capital to guarantee trades amid wild price swings. That's pushing European Union officials to intervene to prevent energy markets from stalling, while governments across the region are stepping in to backstop struggling utilities. Finland has warned of a Lehman Brothers moment with power companies facing sudden cash shortages. Many companies are finding it increasingly difficult to manage margin calls and exchange requirement for extra collateral to guarantee trading positions when prices rise. That's forcing utilities to secure multi-billion euro credit lines while rising interest rates add to costs. So remember, Europe has price caps in place, so the prices paid by retail consumers is not allowed to rise, even though the price of that generation continues to go up, which means these utilities are going further and further in debt. So now who has a problem? The banks have a problem, because if these utilities go bankrupt, those debts will default, and then you've got a financial crisis on top of your energy crisis. So really, they're bailing out the banks here. So far, Germany has introduced Europe's biggest scheme to backstop companies affected by the fallout of the Ukraine war, setting aside 7 billion euros in loans to be made available to companies facing liquidity issues. Germany's energy giant Uniper last week saw an extra 4 billion euros after fully using a 9 billion euro existing facility, while Austria extended a 2 billion euro credit to cover the trading positions of Vienna's municipal power utility. Finland and Sweden announced a 33 billion euro emergency liquidity facility Sunday to backstop utilities through loans and credit guarantees. The underlying issue of the gas market is a lack of supply, and price caps won't ease the strain or add to reserves, according to the Equinor executives. It doesn't create any solution to the problem. Gas is a global commodity. We don't have that much supply, so there's not much we can do. In other words, these price controls won't work, and therefore the power generators will have to pay these higher prices for the gas. And since the utility bills won't be allowed to rise, someone else has to pay for it, i.e. the taxpayers. So now we have the third facet of Europe's economic death triangle. And you have to look at the net effect of these three things combined, because prices don't stop going up until supply and demand reach equilibrium, while the European government has taken off the table any policy that would reduce demand or increase supply. So your utilities will continue to pay these higher and higher fuel prices, selling that energy at an ever-increasing loss to the retail customers who aren't being charged anymore. And in order to make that work, the government is going to print an endless supply of money in the form of bailouts to those utilities, and therefore the price is going to keep going up, and it's not going to stop. Europe is going to print an endless supply of money, and theoretically the price of energy in Europe would reach infinity this winter. Well, if energy prices were to approach infinity, that would create hyperinflation, something Germany is all too familiar with. Of course, in theory, that's what would happen, but that's not what's going to happen, because European governments will start rationing power long before those prices ever actually reach infinity. But that power rationing will also cause hyperinflation, and to understand that, you have to go back in time to the 1920s in Weimar Germany. See, in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, and basically the Treaty of Versailles said World War I was all the fault of Germany, and therefore Germany has to pay reparations to all the other European countries for the harm that was done by World War I. In June of 1921, the first payment for the Treaty of Versailles was due. At the time, $1 was worth about 90 German marks. So how did Germany get the money to pay for the Treaty of Versailles? Well, the same place Europe is going to get the money for the energy bailouts. They turned to the printing press. Now, printing marks in order to pay your debts is something that causes inflation. It devalues the currency. And so by the first half of 1922, $1 is now worth 320 marks. Now the Allies are no longer willing to take marks as payment because the value keeps going down. They demanded payment in their currencies. So the German government decided to start printing marks in order to buy foreign currencies in order to make those payments. That caused an acceleration in the decline of the mark to the point where by December of 1922, $1 was worth 7,400 marks. Now I want to pause here for a second and remind you of this. This is the value of the euro against the US dollar over the last year, because the European Central Bank right now is printing euros in order to solve their problems with some of the southern states having a debt crisis and to backstop their utilities. Meanwhile, other countries are tightening in order to fight inflation. This is causing people to dump their euros and buy dollars, just like what was happening in the early 1920s in the Weimar Republic. But the printing of money to pay the Treaty of Versailles caused high inflation in Weimar Germany, but it didn't cause hyperinflation. The hyperinflation didn't start until January of 1923, Because at the end of 1922, Germany missed their payment on the Treaty of Versailles. They could no longer print enough marks to buy foreign currencies. And in response to that missed payment, French and Belgian troops occupied Germany's Ruhr Valley. Now, the Ruhr Valley was Germany's industrial hub. And the reasoning of the French and the Belgians was that if the Germans won't pay us in currency, we'll take their industry and those goods and services will make up the payment. Now, this is when Germany went from very high inflation to hyperinflation, because the Ruhr Valley is where most of the manufactured goods in Germany were produced. Well, without the supply of goods and services from Germany's industrial hub, now you had not only an excess of currency with all the marks that had been printed, but you had a shortage of stuff on top of that. Extra money, not enough supply of stuff. Now you've got hyperinflation. And by November of 1923, one US dollar was worth 4.2 trillion marks. From 90 marks to the dollar in June of 1921 to 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar in November of 1923. It was the shortage of stuff caused by the loss of their industrial output in the Ruhr Valley that tipped Germany from high inflation into hyperinflation. And I'm talking about this now because what do you think is going to happen when energy is scarce this winter? Do you think they're going to shut off the power to people's homes? No, they're going to shut off the power to all the factories and all the industrial facilities in Europe. In fact, it's already starting. Steel mills, aluminum smelters, zinc smelters, they're shutting down all across Europe. Fertilizer plants are shutting down all across Europe. These factories will not be able to operate with these power prices that are already too high. These power prices are going to keep going higher. There's going to be no new supply brought online. There's going to be no demand destruction on the retail side. So the European governments are going to tell the industrial producers, you have to shut down. That's going to cause a shortage of stuff in Europe. And in 2021, there was about $2.5 trillion worth of manufactured goods produced in the European Union. That's almost 15% of all global manufacturing was in Europe in 2021. And almost all of that will be shut down this winter because they won't have enough power to keep the lights on and to keep people warm and run their factories at the same time. And if you're a politician, are you going to make kids in their bed cold, or are you going to shut down the big greedy corporations that are trying to get rich while polluting our atmosphere? Of course you're going to shut down the industrial producers. And when there's all this extra currency caused by the bailouts of the utilities, and when there's no new energy supply coming online in order to lower power prices, and at the same time, now there's a shortage of manufactured stuff on the shelf, that's when Europe gets hyperinflation. So if Europe doesn't change course and they stay on this suicidal path of this economic death triangle, then there's going to be one of two outcomes. Power prices will rise and continue to rise, and they won't stop no matter how much money they print, approaching infinity, which will result in hyperinflation. Or they could ration power supplies, force the industrial output to shut down, which will cause a shortage of goods on top of the excess of currency, and they'll get hyperinflation that way. Either way, right now, Europe's idiotic energy policy will result in hyperinflation, and the only way to stop this outcome is by abandoning Keynesian economics and abandoning this religious, dogmatic obsession with climate change. And if Europe's leaders don't grow up and change course fast, then 340 million people living in the European Union will be below the poverty line by this time next year. I really hope I'm wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. And if you want to know why I think this transition to clean green energy is fake, you can check out this video I did about how after decades of investment in wind and solar, we are still hopelessly addicted to foreign fossil fuels. Till next time, live small and dream big.